our starting point in the work we do is with a notion of what you might call cognitive or mental ecologies. So we're interested in, if you like, the intersubjective field out of which our own individual thoughts come. So if you think of the kinds of things we're familiar from Freud's work or from sort of early psychoanalysis, very vivid symptoms of things like people who would bend over their backs in a sort of arcing cartwheel, or people who might have the experience of something stuck in their throat. These are sort of symptoms that people had in psychosomatic illnesses in the 19th century. And we don't tend to see those things anymore. People don't tend to report those symptoms. But things like fatigue as a symptom, the sense of kind of overwhelming tiredness, that's been a part of the symptom pool for 200, 300 years, and it's still something that we can experience. So that idea that there are certain kinds of experiences which are distributed historically, culturally, is kind of getting at the idea of this mental kind of cognitive ecology. It's not just about thinking; it's about all the other kinds of things we're all interested in: affects, embodied experiences, material engagement with the world, and so on. So when we think about ecology, we tend to use the phrase experience ecology rather than just purely mental or cognitive. This idea of an experience ecology as being a sort of distributed field of ways of relating to others, to the world, to ourselves is a kind of a starting point within that. So on that basis, thinking about reparation then is about thinking about, well, what is it that's distributed within that experience ecology? What's the relationship between the experiences that are distributed? So reparation is concerned, I think, with the relationships between those things that are in the experience ecology and trying to think through what it means for those experiences to be distributed at a particular time.
So what specific does the term ecology does in the experience ecology?
For me, that does quite a lot of work in trying to understand how experiences which are derived from one kind of setting can work their way into other kinds of settings. So, to give an empirical example of that, in previous work I've done with Paula Reevey on looking at sexuality and how in secure psychiatric units people tend to develop, or service users can sometimes find themselves relating to themselves as sexual beings in a very particular kind of way. And in particular, they can come to see themselves as sexuality as a kind of a threat. Sexuality is a problem. Sexuality is something that needs to be contained in some way. And that experience comes from the ways in which they are sometimes encouraged to feel about their bodies, within psychiatric units. So you get this kind of sense then that certain kinds of experiences learned in one kind of a place become transplanted, distributed, taken away into other kinds of places, and that sets up real problems. So that got us into thinking then about this sort of spatial distribution, but also more broadly about how experiences kind of travel and transplant themselves, and they go from kind of so it is sort of mixing up, I think, different notions of ecology, and it is also, I think, in inviting value judgments. It is inviting evaluations about how do we think about the diversity of experiences? How do we think about how things relate to one another? How do things move and travel within that field?
Why is memory an important ingredient of repair?
One of the basic positions in thinking about memory within a social framework is to think about what memory does, and what memory does is connect experience. It connects the past and the future. It enables us to make sense of the present. And rather than view the past as a sort of inert record of things that happened. So, if you like, the importance of memory is to see memory as an ongoing relationship to the past that creatively generates new possibilities, new potentials for the future, that enables us to reframe the present. So, that said, when you have a difficult past, when you have a past either at a personal or a collective level that involves managing, trauma, that involves managing difficulty, that involves managing conflict, violence, that past, a difficult past, becomes pretty critical to making sense of who you are as a person. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be part of every conversation about who you are, but it nevertheless becomes sort of threaded through a lot of what you are and what you're able to become, revolves around that relationship to a problematic past in some ways. Eduardo Vivero de Castro's idea that, treat everything as 100% relational, whatever it is, even the things that are most personal are 100% relational. That's the kind of approach we're bringing to memory. So even though it's ours, it's never really ours in that kind of self-contained sense. It belongs amongst the kind of communities of rememberers and more broadly within the kind of ecologies where it sits. Memory is a sort of a long-standing kind of concern, but what is important about memory is, I think, sort of recognizing the dynamism to memory, as well as recognizing inherently memory is what connects us to others.
I want to ask you, how does this relate to a concept that you use in your work on traveling memory? Why is memory traveling? What is the traveling dimension?
I mean, the notion of traveling memories comes from Astrid Erll, a wonderful German academic, and in her work, I think she uses the notion of traveling memory to indicate a sort of shift in how people have thought about memory. That there was a sort of big movement to look at memory in relation to place. So this comes from Pierre Nore's work, looking at how memory becomes sort of engraved into particular kind of places. So this is, the lieu de mémoire in Nora's work, so this is things like, how does the Eiffel Tower enact a kind of collective memory of Frenchness? How does an urban space encode within it certain kinds of memories of communities? And I think what Earl points to is, that kind of works very well in a sort of pre-mediatized society, or that works very well when memory was a matter of sort of literally engraving it on the space. And in her work, she points out to the massive kind of distribution of memory that happens, through all the kind of globalized networks that so many people have written so much about. So her introduction to the term traveling memory was about trying to shift, where do we look for memory? And we perhaps shouldn't look for it necessarily in specific given places, but look at how it kind of moves around. Many people who've been on that journey have been in institutional journeys their entire life. It's not their sort of first time that they've spent in a secure institution of some sort. So they've also sort of been traveling institutionally. And so for us, the interesting question is, or, not just for us, the project partly came from the institution itself, that they had observed they were sort of puzzled as to why many people who'd been in that institution, despite having been transferred hundreds of miles, chose to stay in the local area once they were, they were stepped down out of secure care. So why would you choose to stay somewhere where you've never actually been in that city before, because you've been in this big institution in the city? So for them, it was a sort of slight kind of puzzle. Often they can't go back to where they were living before. Often, they have a disrupted relationship to family and friends. They have a really problematic relationship to the past. So in some sense, it's kind of understandable, but nevertheless, if our possibility of having a future depends upon our relationship to that past, then how is that being managed? How can service users maintain that relationship? What's the institution's responsibility? One of my ideas that I had before working, doing social research in these kinds of psychiatric institutions was I imagined memory would be a big issue. I thought it would be like our stereotypes of therapy, where people spend sort of 20 years kind of working through what their relationship is to their parents or to an event or something like that. And that's not at all how these institutions work. They are fundamentally not interested in sorting out or solving those kinds of relationships to the past. And the therapies that are on offer actually push the other way. Things like dialectical behavior therapy. So it's, you can kind of think of it as like cognitive behavior therapy, which is an intervention which is designed to get people to focus on the here and now and focus on doing the things that you need to do to live, rather than getting kind of hung up in your relationships to things. And dialectical behavior therapy is that, plus some mindfulness and other kinds of things added on top. So it's fundamentally about getting people to have a functional relationship to the present, and don't allow your entanglements with the past to interrupt that fundamental relationship to the present. When you are detained, by definition, your contact with the outside world is reduced, and the whole way in which you can kind of maintain those ordinary everyday interactions that might resource a relationship to the past is becomes really problematic. A lot of the sort of basic material infrastructure of everyday remembering is removed in psychiatric units, and service users are working with what they've got, which is often not a lot, really. What's important is that material dimension of memory, the kind of mundane material dimension of memory. For all of us, memory is so much in the sort of artifacts and the resources that we have around us, at a kind of everyday level.